And welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Beanie Wells. That's Danny Cannell. That's Bud Elliott. That's Tom Fernelli. I'm Chip Patterson coming to you live at CBS Sports Network. Fired up to get you set for the week ahead in the Week 10. And yes, as you see, when we are joined by an All-American Ohio State legend, yeah, you know the Buckeyes got a big game coming up this weekend. So, Beanie, I appreciate you joining us. Our colleague here at CBS Sports, CBS Sports Network, you can see him all over the place, including that excellent, soon-to-be award-winning pregame show from 9 to noon, college football pregame. So, Beanie, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. But I would say, can we just start jumping in? Give me your temperature of the Buckeyes right now, because we've had some performances that have kind of been all over the map, sometimes within the same game. When you look at Ohio State, what do you think are the strengths and weaknesses for this team as they prepare for the home stretch?
You know, that's a very good question. You know, when you look at Ohio State, they've been all over the place, as you just mentioned. So it's kind of hard to dial in on, one specific area that's been, a staple point for this football team. I certainly think you can go to the secondary. You can look at those guys and the way that they played. And Denzel Burke, obviously inconsistent in the game versus Oregon, but overall, I think he's been very good. Lathan Ransom, I think he's been phenomenal. That secondary and that linebacking core, I think, is the staple point for this football team. I know in years past, you would always look on the offensive end, but right now, especially with the injuries up front, I just don't know that it's it.
From what you've seen so far this season, Beanie, from the Buckeyes, there was the loss earlier this year on the road to Oregon, a very close game, a game that, they had a chance to win at the end. What's the one area of the football team that you've been most impressed by so far in 2024?
I think outside of last week, I would say the running game. Obviously, the running back duo that we have in Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, those guys have been phenomenal. They've been creating the big plays. But now when you have these offensive line issues, I think that, is a little bit different now, because what we saw last week wasn't what we've seen in prior weeks. Ohio State's been able to dominate running the football, and last week they were stifled. And I think that was a lot attributed to the offensive line issues.
Beanie, keeping in mind that both offensive tackles now are out for Ohio State, which is unfortunate because I feel like no team out there has good depth. What's some stuff that maybe you haven't seen them run, or maybe you haven't seen them run very much of, that you'd like to see them break out for this Penn State game?
Pushing the ball downfield. I think that's been a major issue. I don't think we did enough of it versus Oregon. And last week, particularly, we maybe had one play where we pushed it downfield, but that all comes due in part to being able to protect the quarterback, giving him time. That's something I do believe that we're going to have to do consistently if we're going to have an opportunity to not only beat Penn State, but make a run to a Big Ten conference championship, is push the ball downfield consistently and not just picking and choosing when you do it. I think Ryan Day mentioned in his presser today and last week, that's something that's going to be of emphasis for this offense.
One of those pieces to push the ball downfield, too, has been Jeremiah Smith, the superstar freshman. You are used to being a Buckeye, either playing with guys who were superstar freshmen. You probably were a superstar freshman. They're all over the place, but this one feels different. How would you stack up Jeremiah Smith just in the historical, context of the players that have gone through Columbus and potentially even all of college football?
You know what, man? When you look at him, he's just different. Just his body control, just the veteran moves that he has running routes. His awareness is, incredible. I stack him up. He's probably like Julio Jones in terms of being that big, that physical, that can run and catch everything around him. But when you talk about Buckeye receivers and the Buckeye greats, you certainly have to go back to Ted Ginn Jr. and his impact that he had his freshman year. Obviously, I think Jeremiah Smith is certainly going to be more because he's on the field a lot more as the unquestioned starter and unquestioned number one receiver. But it's nothing short of amazing watching this guy. And I can't believe that he was in high school last year. I think when you watch this guy play, he speaks and he plays like he's a 3 or 4 year guy out there starting.
Beanie, I have not, that I can recall, seen a disconnect between the cold record, the way the numbers look on the paper, and the way that some of the conversations are around a head coach, like with Ryan Day. And I just, you're right there. You're with Ohio State fans. And I mean, Is it fair? Like, I can't believe this guy is 62-9. He is 41-4 in Big Ten play. It is bananas, and yet you continually hear some of the frustration. And I know Ohio State's a huge fan base, and you're always going to have the crazy voices be amplified more. But how do you describe that disconnect between the actual on-field results and the way that some Ohio State fans feel and the pressure that is sort of put upon Ryan Day?
You know, look, I mean, at Ohio State, everybody wants perfection. You want to be in the big game every single year, and you want to go out and dominate Michigan, more importantly. And that's something that he hasn't been able to do the last couple of years. So I think to a degree, it's warranted, especially when you don't beat Michigan on a consistent basis. But when you look at his overall record, the guy's getting you in big games. He's not going out and just being dominated in the games that he does lose on a big stage, outside of obviously the one versus Michigan. When you look at his record, 62-9, that's phenomenal. Any other team in college history would love that. But Ohio State fans are spoiled. You know, they're used to being top tier in that upper echelon. And, it's hard for them to come down off that high horse at times.
It's funny we mentioned Ryan Day's record overall and in these games against top 5 teams. It's like I always feel like it's important to mention that in these games against top 5 teams, Ohio State's always ranked in the top 5 alongside the team that they're playing, which is something I feel like Ohio State fans tend to overlook a bit. But regardless of the Ryan Day situation and everything surrounding the narrative about the big games, with Ohio State having lost earlier this season on the road to Oregon and now facing another top 5 team in Penn State with a loss on the record already in 3rd place in the Big Ten, is this a must-win for the Buckeyes on Saturday? Like, what happens if they lose this game?
No, I think absolutely it's a must-win. When you understand the matchup versus Penn State and where you already sit in the Big Ten standings, and then knowing how you lost versus Oregon and knowing the ultimate goal is to win a Big Ten championship, get in the college football playoff, you absolutely have to go out and win this game. If you don't win it, I think most certainly you're just hoping and praying for things to fall your way and for you to get an opportunity to get into the college football playoff, sitting on the outside looking in. But I know Ohio State's a team and Ryan Day is a coach that loves to be in control of their own destiny. They don't want to leave it to anybody else for them to get in to achieve their ultimate goal. And that's, winning a Big Ten championship and being in that college football playoff, that big dance that we all believe. So most certainly it is going to be a tough matchup on the road in a tough environment, but it is indeed a must win. And I think they have to have that mentality going into this game.
Beanie, who's the guy for Penn State that, given your knowledge of this Ohio State roster, that keeps you up at night? Like, man, this is going to be tough.
Abdul Carter. 100%. That guy off the edge will be a freaking nightmare, especially not having a starter, unquestioned starter there at the left tackle spot. That's an individual that can impact the game drastically. He can pin his ears back and just come after the quarterback. And if I'm Ohio State, I'm certainly doing max protection, bringing in the back and chipping, bringing in the tight end and chipping wherever he's going to be on that football field, because you can't afford to let him beat you. And we saw last week versus Nebraska, Ohio State have some trouble there in the trenches protecting versus edge rushers, and when they didn't see one, that's the capability of Abdul Carter.
Beanie, you played in some iconic stadiums. You played in some massive games. Where does Beaver Stadium rank as far as hostile environments, loud, crazy atmospheres? How does it stack up against the very best?
Oh, man, it's up there. It's crazy. From the moment you get off the bus, you're walking through their fans to get to your locker room. So they're there yelling at you, and then they're on top of you. And then let's not forget about the fact that it'll be a whiteout, I'm sure. So that is so loud. You can barely hear. You hear the cat roaring left and right in that stadium. It's a tough place to play. I've played in some tough stadiums. I would say Washington is very tough. Madison, Wisconsin is very tough, but Penn State probably is the number 1 place, especially when they have a very good football team.
All right, Beanie. Totally unbiased, I'm sure. You are a professional. What game prediction? What do we think happens?
I think Ohio State shores up some issues that they had on the offensive line. I think Ohio State wins this game, and it's going to be because of the defense and how they step up and get pressure on whether it's Drew Aller or their backup quarterback. When you look at Drew Aller, he's been great all year, but mainly going to Tyler Warren. He hasn't been really good going to the other wide receivers. So I think they isolate Tyler Warren and put an extra guy on him and try to make Drew Aller beat him with his arm to other targets. So I think the Buckeyes win this game because of their defense.
He is Beanie Wells, Ohio State legend, our friend, and a CBS Sports Network, CBS Sports and CBS Sports HQ star. Beanie, thank you very much.
Appreciate you guys for having me.
All right, and coming up on the other side, we will start our big game breakdowns for Week 10, and we'll stay right on that topic. Keys to the game, X factors, matchups to watch for Ohio State's visit to Penn State. All that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Our thanks to Beanie Wells. He gave us a little bit of look inside that Ohio State program, strengths, weaknesses, and more. Now it's time for us to spin it forward as we do every single week with our big game breakdown. So, Danny, massive, massive game. So many different layers to this. Where does your mind drift first when you're trying to game out the Ohio State-Penn State matchup?
The first thing, Chip, is who the heck's playing quarterback for Penn State? Is it Drew Aller or is it Bo Pribula, who came off the bench against Wisconsin? And that's probably going to be one of those hold till the last minute. We're not telling anybody until we get there. So from that perspective, and this would also go into the aspect of if Drew Aller's banged up, while the importance of getting Nick Singleton and Katron Allen going in the run game, right? And I know this offense has been more explosive. Like they've had more 20-plus yard explosive plays this year than they had almost entirely last year. But that being said, I think it's imperative that they get the run game going. And whether whoever's playing quarterback, I just feel like that's where Ohio State has been vulnerable. This is a team that has to dominate the line of scrimmage, and I think it starts with an offensive line up front against the strength of the Buckeyes' defensive line. Until you establish that, then I think you try to take your shots. You get Tyler Warren involved. You try to start taking those shots. But I think everything starts with Penn State and their ability or inability to get the run game going.
Completely agree, Dan. I like what Bo Pribula did, but ultimately, can he do that against Ohio State? Ohio State is a lot more athletic than Wisconsin was. Wisconsin's defense for a lot of the year wasn't very good. They played three opponents who were really hurting, and all of a sudden they looked way improved, and then Penn State just looked bigger, stronger, faster. But Penn State won't look bigger, stronger, faster on Saturday than Ohio State. They might look equal to Ohio State potentially because they do a great job of strength conditioning, and they do recruit at a high level. But they probably won't be able to just run by Ohio State. So can they run the ball enough, like Danny was saying? I think that's so key because a lot of what Andy Cudle-Nicky, the new offensive coordinator for Penn State, wants to do is going to key off that run game. And you do see him scheme some guys just wide the heck open. So that I could see happening if Penn State can get that run game going.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the injury situation going into this game, first of all, it stinks that we've got this top 5 matchup between these two teams, and there are so many injury questions on both sides. I would rather see these teams playing at full strength than in the current situation, but I'm far more confident in Drew Aller will be playing in this game than I am with what Ohio State is dealing with injury-wise, because I think with Aller, it would look to be, just my pure guess, they're calling it a lower body injury. It looked to be some kind of sprained ankle to me. Now, how badly it was or whatever, it's just, there's no reason for Penn State to tell you he's going to play until they absolutely have to tell you whether he's going to play or not because of the difference in the way that their offenses look between Aller and Pribula. But the biggest question mark is who's starting at left tackle for Ohio State. It's just, can Ohio State run football with whoever is starting at left tackle? Because since losing Josh Simmons, they have had 60 snaps where they have run the ball without Simmons at left tackle. They're averaging 2.2 yards per carry and have picked up no yards or lost yards on 37% of those plays. The run game was non-existent last week against Nebraska. And if you look at the situation in this matchup, Beanie was on earlier. Who's the one player he's terrified of in this matchup? Penn State's Abdul Carter. And if you're Ohio State and you're worried about that Penn State pass rush, the best way to slow it down is to run the ball at it. But if you can't run the ball, then you're really kind of in a, you're in a real bind because the passing game will be disrupted. And if you can't run, it's like you're going to have a very difficult time moving the ball and putting points on the board. So I wonder if this is finally the week we see Ohio State use Will Howard as a runner, because if you've watched this season, the most he's run in a single game, that if you don't include sacks, is 9 times in the Iowa game for 28 yards. he's a much more, effective runner than that, or what Ohio State has bothered using him for. So I feel like if there's ever a week where you're really going to put that QB run game in action, it has to be this week to kind of take some of the pressure off of your offensive line, to make the defense hesitate for even a fraction of a second, to buy your guys a little bit of time to find that hole and pick up yards, because it's going to be hard to get big explosive runs in this game, because Penn State truly is one of the best run defenses in the country. But you have to be able to keep them honest to get those plays in the pass game. Like also Beanie mentioned, the lack of downfield threat in the passing game so far this year. If they want to be able to utilize that against Penn State this week, against a secondary that I think hasn't truly been tested by a great passing offense to this point, you need to figure out ways to neutralize that pass rush. And I think the best way to do that is running the ball. Can they?
Yeah, two things. Number one, there was a lot of great commentary and analysis in an article I was reading on CBSSports.com. It's a big time article. It's by Tom Fornelli. That's right. I would suggest somebody go and check that out. It's definitely worth your time. Every single week, Tom's takes on the Big Ten. It's always right around here. So love that, and please go check that out. Second, Bud, you've had your eyes on Ohio State play calling, and that's why my ears perked up when you were able to ask Beanie earlier, what would you like to see them run? So just sort of either from your own conversations with people around football, or even from your own knowledge, like Bud, what would you like to see Ohio State start to do in order to maybe counteract some of their injury issues?
I think Tom really nailed it. It's the ability to be +1 in the run game with the addition of the quarterback legs. Ohio State's offensive line was kind of a question coming into this season. When Simmons went down, it became a major question. When Mahalski went down, it became like an all hands on deck. And we said on Cover 3 on our YouTube channel yesterday, like this could be a fatal flaw for this Ohio State team. Like most teams cannot afford to lose two good offensive tackles. You just can't keep good depth now in the transfer portal era. So the ability to be +1 in the run game, to have the defense have to account for an extra hat, I think that really could be the difference here for Ohio State in a game that I don't really think anybody expects to be all that high scoring, because Ohio State's style of defense probably should work against what Penn State wants to do. Like they can hold up in single coverage a heck of a lot better against these Penn State receivers than they could against the Oregon receivers.
Danny, who's a player or an aspect of this game that we're not talking about? I mean, it's one of the biggest games of the entire college football season. We know about Will Howard and his legs. We've got the huge question marks over the Penn State quarterback situation. Where do you think there's that? Because oftentimes it is somebody that's like not the first or second line, but maybe that third or fourth line in the way that you're looking at these two teams in a heavyweight battle. Who's somebody who might step up and be a hero on Saturday?
I'll go with a position group because as much as we were talking about Penn State wanting to run the football, it is running right into the strength of this Ohio State defense, is giving up under 3 yards per carry per rush. So when I look at the group that I think has been non-existent, the one that we've longed to see is Penn State's wide receiving core. Is it Harrison Wallace? Is he going to step up like he did against West Virginia? Is it Julian Fleming who would wake up out of nowhere? And we all know about Tyler Warren, and we heard Beanie Wells saying they're going to have a plan for Tyler Warren, which they will. So which wide receiver, Omari Evans, like one of these guys needs to step up, and it's not going to be a game where I think you go off for 150 or even 100 yards plus. It's when those plays are to be made, which receiver for Penn State steps up and makes that play. Like that's the position group I'm looking at as the great unknown, that if Penn State wants to get over this hump, beat this team for the first time in 7 years, that the receivers will have to step up. Even if they're running the ball good, like even if they're running the ball with some success, somebody from that wide receiving core has to step up and make a play for Drew Aller or Bo Pribula, one of those guys.
You know what, Daniel? I'm going to counter your Penn State receivers with Ohio State's secondary, because I'm coming at this from a very similar aspect. Like Lathan Ransom is expected to be back for this game for Ohio State, which is good. He's one of the better safeties in the country. He missed last week's game against Nebraska. But if you look at the matchup, if Drew Aller plays, and that is a big X factor, and I do expect that he is likely to play, so far this season, Penn State, even with the lack of that top name receiver who's making all these big plays, the explosive plays, This offense still ranks 4th nationally in explosive play rate in as far as the passing game is concerned. It's usually with Tyler Warren, and they're not a whole lot of 70 to 80-yard touchdown bombs, but they are able to get 15 to 25-yard chunks with a high frequency. And if we go back to Ohio State's game against Oregon, on the season overall, Ohio State's defense isn't giving up a lot of explosive passing plays. They're not elite, but they do rank in the top 20th. But you can also counter that by saying the only real passing attack Ohio State has seen to this point of the season was Oregon, and Oregon tore them apart repeatedly. So can Penn State do that, or can Ohio State adjust? Can Denzel Burke have a much better day than he did against Evan Stewart? Can the return of Lathan Ransom help this secondary keep things in front of them and force Penn State to put together much longer drives if they're going to find the end zone or settle for field goals? I think that will be a key part of this game as well.
See, that's what I'm talking about. So, we talk about all these headliner things, but really it might be some groups that are a little bit spotty that are lining up against each other to see who's going to end up bringing it on a really, really big stage. I love that there. Penn State's pass catchers against Ohio State's secondary. Okay, Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern time is when we will unfurl our best bets for this matchup as part of our locks episode. But here on CBS Sports Network, I figure we can give some leans, or at least an early notion on the way this might end up being decided. So, Tom, what's your early thought on what ends up happening on Saturday in Happy Valley?
Well, something's got to give here, Chip, because James Franklin is 1-8 versus top 5 teams and 1-9 versus Ohio State, while Ryan Day's only 2-6 versus top 5 teams. One of them has to improve their record slightly on Saturday. Right now, just based on injury situation, I don't have a super high level of confidence in anything, but I'm leaning Penn State.
I'm leaning a little bit more of an Ohio State low-scoring game. Like I think the race to 21 takes this home.
I'm with Bud, leaning towards a lower scoring game. And my goodness, I loved Penn State a couple weeks ago. Maybe after that USC game, Drew Aller took a step forward. Very much keeping an eye, trying to find out if he's starting or not. But even if he is, how banged up is he? And how about Will Howard throwing some gasoline into the mix here, saying how much he would felt, he's stoked for this game because Penn State didn't think he was good enough coming out of high school. A little chip on the shoulder that's growing by the day as we get closer to this game. But I do think it'll be lower scoring.
I know Julian Fleming is a huge fan of the Cover 3 podcast, so he's obviously locked in. So I want to say, Julian, this is your moment. People will forget anything that's ever happened. You show up in this game, you win this game for the Penn State and Indy Lions, you'll go down in history. So I'm looking at the home dog here as we sit here in the early parts. We'll see if I'm still feeling frisky by the time we get to Moneyline Sprinkles on Thursday. Well, coming up on the other side, it's time to give that big game breakdown treatment to Oregon's visit to go play Michigan in the Big House. We got some quarterback situation as usual with the Wolverines, and Oregon's looking awesome. Where will this game be decided? We'll let you know next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, on Saturday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, your big time game on CBS is going to feature those #1 Oregon Ducks once again. This time they're on the road in one of the great coliseums in all of college football, the Big House in Ann Arbor. Now, this season has not gone as many expected for Michigan, and we've got even more sort of news as we look at that Michigan offense, as Jack Tuttle has announced that he's shutting it down. He is retiring. It is another concussion for him that is having him walk away from competitive college football. So I guess it's Davis Warren. I guess maybe an Alex Orji situation. A lot of question marks there for Michigan at the quarterback position. But I guess, Tom, I want to start off, with having gotten that intimate look at Oregon's, fast start and dynamic offense over the weekend. I mean, do you think Michigan's defense has enough to be able to slow down Dylan Gabriel and the Ducks, given the way that they are flying right now?
It's tough to answer that question without knowing the complete status of Will Johnson. I think that if Will Johnson isn't playing in this game and he's unavailable, no, I don't think Michigan has enough to kind of slow down the offense. I'm not sure that anybody in the conference truly does, because we saw earlier in the year, Ohio State is what we consider one of the best defenses in the country and one of the best defenses in the Big Ten, and they couldn't stop Oregon, especially at home. Of course, Michigan being at home, maybe that gives them a bit of an edge. But when I look at this situation, I mean, it's basically the same situation Illinois was in last week. Like it's election season, so I'm just going to use this. They have a very narrow path to victory if they're trying to figure out how this is going to happen for them. And I think if you are Michigan, the only way you can truly do that is to keep that offense off the field and try to control the clock in this game to limit possessions, and hope you can force a few turnovers and a few mistakes to make that happen. Like we all grew up playing, NCAA football and Madden. You know that when you win the coin toss, you always want to kick off to start the game so that way you can get the ball to start the second half. This is one of those few times where if I'm Michigan, I think I want the ball to start the game, because I don't want to put myself in a situation where if Oregon gets the ball and they go right down the field and put me in a hole immediately, I don't want to have to chase from the start when my offense first gets out there, because my offense is not built for that. I kind of want to just control the clock, churn this thing as much as possible, and see if I can turn it into a 8-9 possession game for each team, just to try to keep it close.
8. I mean, Tom, that might be generous, but I think if you're Michigan, you want to play like a 6-possession game here. Yes. In all seriousness, I mean, I'm looking at my preseason notes, and I wrote, any defensive back injuries for Michigan are a problem. Like, they can say whatever they want to now about how they're confident in the backups, but in the preseason, that was not the case. And we knew that if they had any big guys go down, it was going to be an issue. And Will Johnson, obviously being the biggest and the baddest guy for them, if he doesn't play, that's a pretty big deal. Let's recall back 3 weeks ago when Oregon torched what is probably a better Ohio State secondary, certainly a better one if Will Johnson's not in there. I think the path for a victory here for Michigan, kind of as Tom was saying, hold the ball, possess the ball, make it look a lot like the USC game, except it's a lot harder to do that because Oregon's a heck of a lot better, than USC is. It's going to come down to those two beasts in the middle for Michigan on the defensive line. Like, we know Oregon had a little bit of question mark about the interior defensive line. Ohio State did not do a great job of taking advantage of that, really causing them consistent trouble. But I'm not 100% sure that all those issues are gone, right? Like, they're improved, but who have they faced after Ohio State? Not really anybody who would give them a ton of trouble in there, with all due respect to Tom's Illini. So if Michigan wins this game, it's got to be because those two guys just absolutely beat the snot out of those in Oregon interior 3 offensive linemen, caused a lot of problems, got turnovers, and just the ugliest game of the year that Michigan fans will think is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, Mason Graham, Josiah Stewart, TJ Guy, the defensive line of Michigan has to win up front. They've got to be disruptive. The issue with it is that Dylan Gabriel has been so good and continues to get better getting rid of the football on time. It's one thing, and it's such, he's such a veteran, experienced quarterback, and Will Stein has done a great job getting him up to speed where he's comfortable in this. They know that could be an issue. So they're ready to go to a plethora of weapons that they can get the ball quickly to. And that gets very frustrating, gets very taxing on a defensive line to keep putting forth that effort and not get the reward of getting a sack or a big hit on Dylan Gabriel. But I agree with you. They are the ones that could make this game ugly, which is totally what Michigan wants to do. Michigan has clearly issues at quarterback, but at least now with the retirement of Tuttle, I think it's Davis Warren's show. But they're not going to stop using Alex Orji. Like, this is the thing that's kind of wild. I think now we just know, hey, he's kind of a wildcat, and you're really only going to sprinkle him in there if you're going to try to throw ball deep somewhere. They've got to be able to get the run game going. You cannot turn the ball over against this team. Khalil Mullings has kind of taken that role as lead back, as Donovan Edwards has taken a step in the backseat. I've tried to talk myself into, like, where is Michigan? It's a home game. Is Oregon overlooking them? They're traveling across multiple time zones. I just think if Michigan wants to have a chance in this game, Oregon has to be a little bit off. That's like, and yes, you can help dictate that by getting some of those interior pressures and maybe getting a tip ball where you get a turnover, but they have to hit on every play that's there. Oregon, I think, is just so good. They usually, are very smooth on offense. Their defense all of a sudden is becoming an issue for everybody they're playing with. Matayo Uyunglele stepping up. Derek Harmon's also a great defensive player. So I just think this is a matchup where Oregon can overwhelm Michigan pretty much across the board.
Well, let's take a step back and let's sort of look at the big picture for Oregon, because they last time they got up to number 1 back in 2012, they lost the next week. And the way that they have been playing has been, to your point, Danny, it's been getting better and better with Dillon Gabriel. It's been getting more consistent with the offense. Danny, how do you think that you have changed your big picture expectations or thoughts about Oregon in terms of not just where they fit in the Big Ten, but where they fit among the best teams in the country as we start to turn our attention over the next several weeks into, the race for a national championship?
Oh, I think Oregon is the clear-cut best team in the country, and that's coming from somebody that picked them to win the national championship before the year, was ready to bail after watching Idaho and Boise State, saying, uh-oh, but was trying to keep everybody calm, saying, look, a lot of new moving pieces, injuries on the offensive line, and the thing that's been most impressive is they've gotten better and better, and there's players all over the place, NFL talent. I mean, Jordan Birch is a player who hasn't played in a few weeks. When he comes back, I mean, he's the best player on that defensive line. The offense, think about it. They got 2 running backs, Jordan James and Noah Whittington, who both are capable of carrying the workload. They've got a tight end in Starrett Ferguson, who, when he's healthy, he's a weapon that you have to deal with. And then they've got multiple receivers, starting with Tez Johnson, who Dillon Gabriel knows how to get them the ball in space. And that's the other thing. Will Stein knows how to get those players in advantageous matchups so that it's very easy for Dillon Gabriel to get to him. He's very accurate, so he keeps him on the run. You get a lot of yards after the catch. I think they're the most complete team in college football. And I felt like other teams were in that zone. Like I felt Texas was. But Texas failed in their biggest test against Georgia, whereas Oregon, in their biggest test against Ohio State, they answered the call and came up big with the win.
I don't know that I'm necessarily there as being the clear-cut number 1 team in the country, but I do think that Oregon has an argument to be the number 1 team, and I don't know that we have a clear cut this year. You could tell me Georgia's best is better than Oregon's best, or maybe vice versa. You could tell me, hey, maybe Ohio State plays a better game if they play them in a neutral site, like they did lose by a field goal in Eugene. So if that game's in Columbus, Buckeyes probably win. I mean, Texas has looked great at times this year. I do think that offensive coordinator Will Stein is getting more comfortable calling games for Dillon Gabriel, right? You have a different type of receiving core this year. You have a different type of quarterback. Like Bo Nix was pretty good for them last year, and obviously he's doing pretty well so far in the NFL. But Gabriel's a different type of quarterback, a little more limited physically, having to use his brain a lot, and trying to figure out ways to call games for them. I've been encouraged by what I've seen, though. I think it's pretty impressive.
And this is a really good football team. There's really no kind of other way to say it. Are they the best in the country? I don't know. They're going to have an opportunity to prove it. Like if you look at the rest of their regular season schedule, it's hard to see many losses on there. So you can pretty much pencil them in for a Big Ten championship game appearance, and you could probably pencil them in for an at-large in the playoff at a minimum. So we're going to find out just how good they are compared to the other elite teams. But as I watch this team, it's pretty evident week in and week out, like they're getting better. They're figuring things out. They know who they are, and they're not messing around. Like they're not playing with their food. They're coming out in the first quarter, in the first half against these teams that they're supposed to beat, and they're snuffing out any semblance of hope that those teams might have immediately, because they know that the only thing that could really impact the game right now is letting the other opponent actually believe it has a chance to win. And they're telling them right away, no, you don't. It's going to be a long 3 hours, and you're going to go home sad. The only thing I look at as far as this game is concerned, just trying to nitpick to find a reason to think maybe Michigan has a chance to win the game, is if you look at who Oregon's played on the road, it's been Oregon State, UCLA, and Purdue. Not exactly great teams. In fact, UCLA and Purdue are combined 1-8 in the Big Ten, nor are they the kind of environment to play in. Like Purdue, I'll give them some credit. That Friday night game at Ross-Ade Stadium, they were hyped early, but the game was over quick and it kind of quieted down. Will the environment of playing in the big house in a very loud stadium who's actually screaming when you have the ball instead of when your opponent has the ball, will that impact them offensively? Because if you do look at the numbers, their game plans, particularly in the passing attack when they have been on the road, slightly more conservative than they have been at home. They're not taking as many deep shots. They tend to stick to shorter, more safe and efficient throws. So we'll see how that impacts it. But again, it's as far as the game's concerned, it's just hard to see Oregon losing to anybody left on its schedule.
In 1964, there was a very famous argument before the Supreme Court that led to a comment of, quote, "I know it when I see it." And that's kind of how I feel about Oregon as a national title contender. Like, will Oregon win the national championship? Who knows? But they're getting better. They're balanced. They're well-rounded. They have counters, and they have answered the call. So very excited to watch them this Saturday on CBS, kickoff 3:30 p.m. Eastern time from Ann Arbor, and continue to follow the Ducks in their pursuit of championships in their first year of the Big Ten. Well, coming up on the other side, there are some very interesting and important storylines to other Week 10 games in the Big Ten. We'll run through a couple, plus our player to watch later. Next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, we gave you that big game breakdown, looking at Penn State, Ohio State, went into the big time on CBS game of the week, Oregon playing against Michigan, but there's a lot more to get into. And Tom, it starts with a bounce back opportunity for your Fighting Illini, a disrespectful line from the odds makers. But Minnesota has been starting to string some wins together, building some confidence. What do you think that spot looks like for the Fighting Illini?
I think it's going to be a close game. I think it's going to be a tough game. You look at Minnesota coming into this one, they have won 3 straight games after getting off to a slow start, particularly in conference play. And last week they put up 48 points against Maryland, which was the most points they'd scored in a game in 5 years since they played Maryland. So I wonder what that Gophers team looks like, if that offense is truly gelling or if it is a result of the schedule that they've played, because the 3 wins have come against USC, which was a big win, but USC, as we've seen in recent weeks, is not incredible. UCLA and Maryland. Now they're going on the road to play Illinois, coming off a tough, loss at Oregon in which they were completely blown away. And they suffered a couple injuries in that game, but based on what the coaching staff has said this week, I think that most of the guys that kind of got dinged up in that game were just that, dinged up. They're expected to be back. And I think that if you look at Illinois this year, they have been a very good team at home. They've won some big games there. They've beaten some teams along Minnesota's, its ability level, let's put it that way. I think it's a little, like you said, disrespectful for Illinois to be a home underdog here against Minnesota, a team that they've beaten last year in the last few years. So I like the Illini here, but this is a big game for both of these teams because they are kind of stuck in that middle ground in the conference. And if they want to finish in the top half, this is one that both teams need to have.
Danny, we are very quickly turning into the official podcast of the Indiana Hoosiers. We have given minutes upon minutes to the point where it is almost hours, celebrating what Curt Cignetti has done. Now we might be getting Curtis Rourke back after that finger surgery. Taven Jackson held it down, led them to a 14-point win last week. But they are going to go play a Michigan State team with the Spartans at home sort of dismantled Iowa, and they have been a little bit frisky at times. What do you think about Indiana's chances to be able to turn 8-0 into 9-0 through the weekend?
Oh, I like them. The odds makers still just dangling numbers out there that tell you they don't believe in them. It's another rounded touchdown point spread, which is exactly the same as it's been their last 2 home games. And that's one of the things I'm looking at this one, because they really haven't played a true road game. So hear me out. They played UCLA early this season when UCLA was limping around in the Rose Bowl, which isn't exactly the most hostile environment. They went to Northwestern, again, on the lake, and about 3,000 or 4,000 fans that were there. Not exactly a hostile environment. Now they have to go to East Lansing for a true Big Ten road game, where I think this will be the loudest, most hostile environment they've had to have traveled to yet, against a team that, as you mentioned, Jonathan Smith has playing really hard, has them, playing with a ton of confidence, coming off a couple nice wins. I know they lost one recently too, but I think this is a tough out for Indiana, but for a team that's won every game by 2 touchdowns or more, I'm not stepping in front of that freight train and calling the upset, because I'd expect them to respond no matter what type of adversity they're faced with.
Bud, we've got 2 new additions to the Big Ten that so far are imperfect. USC and Washington at their peak have been able to have some really, really good wins and be competitive in big games, but also have far more losses than I think either fan base is used to at this point in the season. As they square off, how do you see this one playing out? Who's got more to gain, more to lose from this matchup?
It's a great question, Chip. Honestly, the loser of this game is going to see their odds to make a bowl plummet, because both USC and Washington, they have really difficult finish stretches. For instance, after this USC game, Washington has Penn State, probably a loss, UCLA, probably a win, and then at Oregon. So if you want to go bowling, Huskies, you kind of need this one. And USC, I think, still has somewhat of a shot to go bowling if they do lose this, because they have Nebraska and UCLA left, who are very winnable games. But there's going to be quite a lot of angst here amongst both fan bases as this game gets close. I tend to lean USC because I think the offense is more trustworthy, and Washington's defense has not been getting very many stops in recent weeks, even against some kind of iffy competition at times. But these teams mirror each other in quite a few ways, which is interesting.
Oh, angsty teams sitting around 500 heading into November. Welcome to the Big Ten, boys. This is what life's like. All right, coming up on the other side, we always like to leave you with one player to watch for Week 10. We'll do that next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, and we always like to leave you with one player to watch heading into the weekend. Danny, who you got your eyes on in the Big Ten for Week 10?
We were just talking about the Indiana Hoosiers taking it on the road, and all eyes are going to be on who's on playing quarterback, but I got my eyes on Justice Ellison, their running back, and the importance of him getting it going. If Curtis Wark does play and that thumb is taped up, I do want to point out Navy last week, Blake Horvath had a thumb that was taped up. It's 6 turnovers later, thinking maybe they should have kept him on the bench, kept him sidelined, potentially give him credit for going out there. But I think it could be an issue for Curtis Wark. So Justice Ellison, get that ground game going for the Hoosiers on the road.
Speaking of on the road, Danny, I'm going to go JTT from Ohio State, right? Penn State looked great last week. Both quarterbacks played great, but they didn't face anybody like him. I think he has a chance to win with some power moves on Saturday. Give me JTT affecting that Penn State backfield.
I'm going to go to the Washington-USC matchup in Seattle this weekend. It doesn't always work out, but one thing I enjoy about Jed Fish, or I admire about Jed Fish, is that he tends to put together smart game plans that make sense based on the opponent that he's facing. And I think if he's watched USC lately, he's probably going to decide he needs to lean on his run game in this one. So I'm going to go with Washington running back Jonah Coleman, who's 4th in the Big Ten with 98.1 rushing yards per game. But the only other Big Ten running back who's carried the ball at least 100 times, averaging more yards per carry than him so far this season, is Iowa's Caleb Johnson. And if you look at USC lately, the run defense has been susceptible. It's been, weakening as the season goes along. And this is also a defense that played 90 snaps last weekend against Rutgers. I think he's going to learn to pound the rock against a, shorthanded depth chart wise on defense USC team that played a lot of snaps last week, and see if he can wear them down.
And I'm going to the new QB1 for the Iowa Hawkeyes. That's right. The Brendan Sullivan era has begun. He comes in, and all of a sudden the Hawkeyes offense is putting up 28 points in a daggum quarter. Iowa fans been hollering for it, and I think this quarterback change is huge going into a big game against Wisconsin. If you liked what you saw, if you liked what you heard, Cover 3 podcast is available all week. You can watch us live on Mondays, Wednesdays, Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can hear us wherever you get your podcast. Just scan that QR code on the screen.